Welcome to our final seminar of the Fall 2024 HMEI Faculty Seminar Series. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Sarah Rivett, who's a professor in the departments of English and in American Studies. Professor Rivett works on a range of topics, looking at one of the things that the description is the connection between the religious phenomena and secular history. So two areas that are often looked at separately, and they're different ways of knowing. And so it's an interesting intersection. And another intersection in which Professor Rivett spends time is the intersection between settler African American and indigenous histories. These are histories that are all present and how they come together. And I think today we're going to hear about Professor Rivett's next book, which is entitled Raven's Land, Placing the Indigenous Northwest Pacific in American Literature. I'm assuming, or unless all you talk about is ravens in different contexts. So with that, I'd like to welcome Professor Rivett. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great, perfect. I want to begin by thanking my colleague Gabrielle Vecchi for inviting me to speak. Imagining the cross-disciplinary forum for this faculty seminar has already expanded my thinking about the concept of ecology that I'll be talking about today. I would also like to thank Hans, Gabriella, for their superb organizing, communication, poster design, and even for telling me about a Tlingit raven rattle at the Met that I didn't know about. Also, thanks to all of you for being here. It's a wonder that we're all still standing at this point in the semester, and I really appreciate your presence. These photographs feature an archaeology and ethnology museum established in 1909 in the same building where we now sit. The museum was the vision of Arnold Guyot, the Swiss-American geologist and geographer after whom this building is named. Though Guyot died in 1884, the museum carried on his legacy. In addition to dinosaurs, the museum included ethnological exhibits described in a 1910 Princeton Alumni Weekly as, quote, primitive cultures of the Greenland Eskimos, the Alaskan Indians, the Pacific Islanders, and the peoples of West Africa. The purpose of the display was to showcase the progress of civilization, manifest destiny unfolding before the viewer's eye. What the article refers to as, quote, Alaskan curios were collected by Princeton-educated Presbyterian missionary Sheldon Jackson, who went to Sitka and Wrangell, Alaska, to convert Native Alaskans to Protestantism. Many were already Russian Orthodox. Guyot also traveled to Alaska, naming a glacier 70 miles north of Yakutat after him, and collecting what he thought of as remnants of pagan and pre-Columbian primitive cultures in the process. Many of these remnants showcase the Tlingit raven, so central to social structure, as well as oral and material traditions. Carvings of rattles, bentwood boxes, bracelets, helmets, masks, and totems depict raven in the form-line design characteristic of Pacific Northwest indigenous art. The exhibit functioned to ensconce Alaskan art, people, and cosmology in the past, configured as the antithesis of modernity. Jackson dismissed the Tlingit raven as a symbol of paganism. Guyot wanted to scientifically prove the creation story in the book of Genesis, thereby enacting a dichotomy that separated the Tlingit raven from its biblical counterpart. Though it changed over the years, the exhibit permanently closed in 2000, with this cartoon sketched on the occasion of its closing. I couldn't resist showing it. I'm not really going to analyze it, but I think it speaks for itself. Most of the Tlingit art collected during this time remains the property of the Department of Geology and Geosciences, though it's now on loan to the Art Museum. I begin with this story to situate my talk in our present location and to describe the forms of knowledge made herein. At first blush, it may seem that the two birds I'm about to describe to you, the raven of the Euro-Christian West and the raven of the Indigenous Pacific Northwest, come from very distinct cultural and literary traditions. But it turns out that these birds have some deep and long-lost commonalities. They converged in this building in the early 20th century, but on this occasion, their convergence worked in the service of disavowing narratological connections. The work of this talk and the larger book that I'm writing is to recover these lost connections and the knowledge lost as a result. So doing is not an easy task, for the paradigms that informed Guyot's Ethnology Museum still influences the way the Academy organizes knowledge and archives today. The Art Museum still holds on to this Native Alaskan art. It retains its colonial status as modern-day curiosities, for we lack the institutional knowledge to understand it. I am trained in a tradition of literary history that, in spite of itself, still clings to vestiges of an American origin story, a way of understanding the colonial roots of the United States. Despite efforts to dismantle the tyranny of telos and linear time informing patriotic myths of America, Americanists have not yet arrived at a viable alternative. This is, in a sense, what I'm grasping to do. Thinking beyond the American origin story requires a willingness to follow the archival trace to surprising and occasionally uncomfortable places. This talk moves across vast swaths of time and place, from the Inuit Arctic to Thomas Jefferson's Virginia, from melting glaciers in the Paleolithic era to the Gnostic Gospels. The trajectory is often surprising, for my method mimics the raven's flight as an alternative to linear chronology. If you have enjoyed lunch outside the university chapel on a beautiful fall day, you may have seen our resident ravens. They swoop up and down, soar, twist, and zip through the air, often in an infectious expression of joy and play. The flight is nonlinear, non-teleological, but it always ends where it began. Here is my beginning. Close to our bows, strange forms in the water darted hither and thither before us, while thick in our rear flew the inscrutable sea ravens. And every morning, perched on our stays, rows of these birds were seen, in spite of our hootings, for a long time obstinately clung to the hemp, as though they deemed our ship some drifting, uninhabited craft, a thing appointed to desolation and therefore fit roosting place for their homeless selves. And heaved, still unrestingly heaved, the Black Sea, as if its vast tides were a conscience, and the great mundane soul were in anguish and remorse for the long sin and suffering it had bred. Herman Melville's phrase, sea raven, assigns a new name to a bird. Part of the inscrutability of the sea raven is the name itself. Sea raven is a loose English translation of Corvus marinus, a classical Latin phrase. By the 19th century, Corvus marinus had morphed into the English word cormorant, or the less familiar phrase sea crow, occasionally used by sailors to describe the cormorant. Through the playful name sea raven, Melville evokes a forgotten relationship between the cormorant and land raven, as well as between sea and land. Descendants of land birds tens of millions of years ago, seabirds remind us that all birds share a connection to the sea. But as ornithology arose as an 18th century science, it inherited a biblical bias against the raven's maritime associations. Land and sea became a primary generic distinction between these birds. From Francis Willoughby to James Audubon, Euro-American ornithology evolves as a discipline that discounts the raven's maritime associations and stringently relegates the bird to barren land. By contrast, indigenous traditions of the Pacific Northwest describe a raven that operates through an intertidal ecology. In the oral literary tradition known as the Tlingit raven cycle, a raven who acts as both trickster and creator moves seamlessly from water to land. Even during destructive cycles of flooding, water is central to raven's survival and patterns of regeneration. Adaptability to the water is also how the Tlingit raven survives the flood. Raven's appetite fuels his adventures through much of the Tlingit cycle, though it's not an appetite of sin, but rather of possibility. He takes pleasure, and the reader or listener along with him, in getting in and out of trouble. Environmental biologists David Raffelli and Stephen Hawkins define intertidal ecology as the particularly dynamic and interactive space between land and sea. In other words, a seashore, but with an understanding of this space as transitional and existing in a constant state of change. Intertidal zones have limitless possibility for ecological and ecophysiological research, especially for understanding dynamic processes and energies of plant, fish, and animal behavior, including measuring the impact of human society on shores. Raffelli and Hawkins explain that the science of intertidal ecology is relatively new, emerging somewhere in the mid-20th century and then picking up steam by the 1990s. It might even make sense to date the emergence of intertidal ecology to the marine biologist Rachel Carson in her 1951 book, The Sea Around Us, which blurs genres of science and poetry to conceptualize the shore as dynamic space. She writes, changing with the swing of tides, belonging now to land, now to sea. Like Melville, Carson associates a lost form of knowledge with the sea. This form of knowledge was never lost to indigenous cosmologies of the Pacific Northwest. European natural history failed to see or conceptualize the intertidal zone as a dynamic and constantly changing and porous boundary. The taxonomies developed by Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus are the most famous example of what this looked like in practice. In the sea raven passage, Melville pokes fun at these categories, showing the failure of Latin nomenclature to erase underlying connections between cormorant and raven, sea and land. Early ornithology inherits this biblical bias against the raven that relegates the bird to barren terrestrial plains that obey the logic of a false binary between land and sea. In Euro-Christian literature, the raven story begins with Genesis. Noah sends a raven from the ark to see if the world is habitable. The raven does not come back, causing Noah to send the dove in its place. Biblical commentators read the raven's failure to return as an act of disobedience, an unwillingness to carry out Noah's instructions. Augustine condemns the raven's attraction to the sea as a site of sin and disobedience. For Augustine, water is the thing that either stood in the way of raven's return or constellated his desire in the form of a floating carcass. And you can see maybe the dead horse on the left-hand slide from the picture Bible. This is the origins of the Western conception of the sea as a site of temptation and sin, as well as an other than human world that had to be cordoned off. Augustine's denouncement of the raven and sea appears in a text also known for its denouncement of Gnosticism. Gnosticism focused on personal spiritual knowledge. The early Christian fathers dismissed these teachings as heresy. In one book, called the Apocryphon of John, water features prominently as a supplement to knowledge of the fall beyond what's available in the book of Genesis. In other words, water conveys knowledge of a world beyond orthodox beginnings. In the beginning, God created, begins the Bible. Gnosticism challenges both the concept of genetic beginnings and God's singular authority. The Apocryphon of John tells the story of a light being named Sophia, who is commensurate to God in her power. She performs an act of disobedience that anticipates the ravens. Aware of the consequences of her disobedience, the Apostle John describes Sophia as moving, quote, to and fro above the water, explicitly echoing the to and fro in Genesis 8:7. which is when Raven leaves and doesn't come back. He flies to and fro. It's a quote from Genesis 8:7. So Sophia's movement above the water mimics the raven's flight and the sea raven's movement above the sinful sea in the passage from Moby Dick with which I began. Neither biblical commentators nor the ornithologists who follow have an interest in discerning what ravens saw or experienced in or around the sea. They take the Augustinian condemnation of the sea for granted. In both Christian theology and natural history, Augustine's concept of the raven's disobedience structures how humans understand ravens' place in the world. So in relegating the raven to land, thus curtailing its flight and maritime associations, ornithologists reinforce a theological punishment of raven's rebellion. As ornithology evolves as a science in the 18th century, the raven either drops out of the discourse entirely or remains associated with uncleanliness and supernatural disorder, an embodiment of an unruly epistemology in the natural world. John Locke's second treatise on government, was published in 1690, linked property rights to labor, thus creating a justification for dispossession. In his new book, Sea Level, Wilco Graf von Hardenberg explains that over the course of the 18th century, the growing infrastructural needs of nation-states solidified land and sea dichotomies as, quote, reciprocally alien worlds. Usable land was dry land, marked by new boundaries that displaced former inhabitants with settlers who had ideas about how it should be farmed. Divisions between earth and sea concretized through 18th century natural history. This caused the loss of certain forms of knowledge about a possible intertidal space, a way of being between two realms. The raven's role in stories of an ancient flood are not unique to Christianity. Such stories abound across cultures. The flood story recounted in the Bible took place in ancient Mesopotamia around the 5th century BCE. Cuneiform records confirm the flood's occurrence and that it's a story much older than the Bible. Archaeologists speculate that the story of the flood recorded in the Bible might have been passed down to the Israelites when they were held in captivity. In Alaska and British Columbia, floods occurred throughout the Paleolithic era. They were coincident with the melting glaciers during the Ice Age. Archaeological records and Tlingit oral histories convey evidence of flooding during this time. Ice melted from the mountain coastlines in the Pacific Northwest. Geological records suggest that people lived within and traversed the Pacific Rim entirely at sea level without major obstruction and within an ecosystem that consisted of both terrestrial and marine resources. Flood stories may concern the same ecological event, or they may cross-pollinate to generate flood myths that are less grounded in historical or archaeological fact. Early humans were far more physically diverse and mobile than they are today, with similar tools found across vast geographic expanses from the Swiss Alps to outer Mongolia, or halfway across the Australian continent. As people migrated, they shared stories as well as tools and language. The flood became a narrative motif that united different traditions. Upon arriving in Alaska, Presbyterian missionaries sought to disavow these connections and relegate the Tlingit raven creation story to erroneous pagan belief. Tlingit storytellers, by contrast, began to merge the two storytelling traditions. So we only have extant versions of the Tlingit raven cycle that are post-contact. Many of them tell a story of Raven and the flood, and many of these stories merge the biblical account with the pre-existing Tlingit account. So Robert Zuboff, who was recorded in the 1970s, compares Master of the Tide, who's a kind of evil uncle to Raven, to the biblical King Herod. And he explains that Master of the Tide creates a flood and builds an ark that's just like Noah in the Bible. So Raven survives by building a duckskin raft for his mother and then realizing that he has the power to change and the gift of immortality in this story. According to Haida oral tradition, the world began as an intertidal zone during the, quote, time of transformation. The ice began to melt, signaling the beginning of the end of the Pleistocene era. According to Haida literature, Rivett caused an island to form, placed the sun and moon in the sky, and then populated the island. Across these Northwestern Pacific Indigenous cultures, Rivett takes on an integral role as creator, moving within this intertidal zone. The Haida word for intertidal identifies the realm as the nexus between ocean and forest. This is also the place that the Haida call home. Land and shore, ocean and forest interface. These communities are marine time adapted, meaning not only knowledgeable about how to survive in intertidal niches, but also instrumental to the management and maintenance of these environments. For at least 4,000 years, the Tlingit communities of southeastern Alaska focused food gathering in intertidal spaces with fishing and shellfish as a mainstay of subsistence. The Tlingit phrase, klenda kagut, translates as, when the tide is out, the table is set. The intertidal zone shapes material life as well as cosmology and history. A bountiful intertidal feast starkly contrasts the Lockean concept of arable land as the premise for colonization and settlement. For coastal First Peoples, the intertidal constituted a liminal space between the spirit guardians from the upper world, including sky, land, and forests, and the underworld of rivers and sea. The ebbing and flowing of the tide caused the spirit worlds to intermingle. Inhabiting a maze of inshore waters, pre-colonial Haida lived off this bountiful feast of shellfish, salmon, and halibut with no need to cultivate crops. Consequently, Haida literature is rooted in the constant presence of the sea. Rivett finds refuge and rebirth moving between land and sea, as well as between surface and depth. These literary histories illustrate a vision of the natural world, where unruliness and defiance of categories is part of the order of things, and non-human life indivisible from humankind. This way of imagining the intertidal extends back for millennia, not as lost or mythological knowledge, but rather as a mode of being and a way of adapting to the circumstances of the current world. What would it mean to reimagine a melting glacier as alive, as an intertidal zone uniting living beings in dynamic processes? What does it mean to think of the glacier not as inert land to be discovered, but as a living vestige of human stories that animate and reanimate an ever-changing world? This painting by Frederick Edwin Church was composed on board a schooner called the Labrador in 1859, at the dawn of the great age of US Arctic exploration. It does not ask these questions. Instead, it imposes a perspective of coastal ice as inert, static land. In Church's painting, icebergs are sheer, immovable matter. The detritus of shipwreck appears in the foreground, as if to confirm the iceberg's utter immovability and convey the sense of terror typical of sublime renderings of nature, such as this one. Theorized by Edmund Burke in the 18th century, the sublime conveys a sense of danger, while the viewer remains in a position of safety. The viewer experiences limitless freedom, mitigated through the frame of a palatable aesthetic experience. Here, light breaks through, a classic example of the luminosity for which American landscape painters were famous. The light conveys a sense of divine authorship that reassures the viewer of God's role in the creation of the world. This same belief in singular divine omnipotence separated the biblical raven from its Tlingit counterpart. Sheldon Jackson worked in concert with geologist William Libby, photographer George T. Emmons, and Arnold Gaio to extract cultural, human, and ancestral belongings from a land deemed stagnant, inanimate, and hopelessly primitive. The 1910 Princeton Alumni Weekly article boasted not only Alaskan curios, but also, quote, partly incinerated human skeletons. In his travels in Alaska, John Muir witnessed the desecration of a totem pole, as part of it was cut by Jackson to ship to Gaio's collection and to eventually end up in the Ethnology Museum. A Tlingit observer turned to Muir to say, "What if we did that to you?" Encoded in this question is a conflict between two distinct cosmologies, one instrumentalized in the service of settler colonization, and one making a case for ancestry and animacy in non-living beings. This totem did contain human remains, which made it subject to repatriation under NAGPRA law in 2021. While Burke theorized natural sublimity as terrifying but safe for consumption, Enlightenment ornithology relegates the raven to a terrestrial space of doomed isolation. Ravens are not birds of passage, the Comte de Buffon tells us in his Natural History of Birds, which came out in English in 1793. They attached to the rock where they were bred, according to Buffon, descending only to procure sustenance. Buffon's description of the raven could be a paragraph lifted from an 18th century Gothic novel. If to the features which we have now traced of the raven, we join its gloomy plumage, its cry still more gloomy, though very feeble, its ignoble port in proportion to its bulk, its savage look, its body smelling perpetually of infection, we shall not be surprised that in all ages it has been regarded as an object of aversion and horror. 7 years after Buffon's Natural History of Birds, the French edition, which was a little before, Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia circulated in scribal copy in Paris. It contained a table of 125 American bird species. Jefferson cross-referenced all the colloquial names of the birds he knew to inhabit Virginia with the Latin binomials of Linnaeus and Buffon. Notably and surprisingly absent from Jefferson's bird corpus is any writing at all about the common raven. A simple explanation for this is that neither does the raven receive mention in his source text, which is Mark Catesby's Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and Bahama Islands, which is thought to be the first American ornithology, first published in 1731, second volume, 1743. Alongside the striking place that the raven occupies in Buffon's text, this peculiar absence begs the question, why? The answer is water. More specifically, the story of the flood. In his appendix, Catesby explains, quote, "There is no part of the globe where the signs of a deluge more evidently appears than in many parts of the northern continent of America. His evidence is excavated fossil shells and bones of sea animals. In his effort to establish North America as the site of Noah's flood, Catesby departs from his European predecessors by excluding the raven from his list of American birds. He offers scientific evidence of Noah's flood to account for the population of American birds. The raven does not fit within the purview of 18th century American ornithology. The world of the raven is a different kind of world." According to philosopher Mark Gluberman, quote, "In Hebrew, the word for raven shares the same stem as evening. The light dawns posterior to it. Raven pre-exists Genesis and the dawning of the human world. This corresponds to the most famous story in the Tlingit raven cycle, Raven in the Box of Daylight. In this story, Raven steals daylight and gifts it to humanity. But in traditions influenced by Christianity, this primordial existence makes the raven unclean. Raven is a trace of the initial chaos, a mingling of elements that should be kept separate. Unsure of what to do with this being from a world beyond the human world, this vessel of chaos and nonlinear temporality, Catesby and Jefferson simply left the raven out of their secular American Eden." In contrast to literary genres indebted to the Christian tradition, the Tlingit raven cycle preserves this knowledge of raven's connection to the sea. In a collection of raven stories, Raven is walking along the beach, situates Raven between earth and sea. Several stories feature the sea prominently as a source of food, mischief, entertainment, and rebirth. Almost all recorded Tlingit storytellers recount Raven and the whale. Details vary in each telling, but the basic plot features Raven observing a whale emerge from the sea while lunching on herring. Raven flies into the whale's spout with a pile of firewood to partake in the feast. Once inside, the raven builds a fire to roast the herring. The whale dies. Storytellers have different accounts of the death. According to Kuchain Francatalio, who is the earliest extant storyteller from Yakutat, Alaska, the fire kills the whale by melting its blubber, which then coats the raven's body. Kuchain says, there he was already jumping around with it. Then fat is all over his body and over his head everywhere. It fell from inside the whale. That's how it is. He killed it. He's killing it. He thinks he can walk up out of that place he flew into like his home. In act of mischief, Raven flies into the whale, not unlike a man named Jonah in another tradition, but I don't have time to make that comparison today. But this is not a story of deliverance. The raven kills the whale and tries to walk out, except he can't because the spout of the whale has closed. So instead, the raven wills the whale to the beach, and then Raven moves out of the story, lost in the air. As he disappears into the world beyond the human world, the raven's appetite proves beneficial to the villagers, for they use the whale fat to cook in bentwood boxes and then feast on the beach, an intertidal zone. Raven's prank transmutes into a communal gift. The whale that features so prominently in the Tlingit Raven cycle evokes a connection with the great sperm whale, Moby Dick. Melville sea ravens appear in chapter 51, The Spirit Spout. This is a chapter of foreboding, beginning with the ominously ambiguous passage of time. Days, weeks passed. The ivory Pequod had slowly swept across the Atlantic, an unstaked watery locality, southerly from St. Helena. Have days rolled into weeks, or is the duration of the voyage unclear and unknown to the narrator, who at this point in the novel is omniscient rather than Ishmael? The passage of time further diminishes Ahab of his humanities as he walks the deck with side-lunging stride. The living leg strides on, the dead leg strikes the deck like a coffin tap. Quote, on life and death this old man walked. Middle-aged and wounded with monomaniacal madness, Ahab paces between life and death, powerless to choose. Born out of an unhealed wound, the quest for Moby Dick wedges the world further at a joint. Ahab and Moby Dick enter into a relationship through a wound, becoming part of each other. Ahab with his ivory prosthetic, and Moby Dick with his consumed human leg. But this presents a way of being in relation through anguish and pain rather than symbiotic connection. Consequently, an unbreachable distance remains between Ahab and the whale, a distance measured through physical space and cosmos, even as both beings merge materially. In the Tlingit Raven cycle, by contrast, the raven also enters into relation with the whale. He enters the whale in pursuit of herring. And yet here, Raven's voracious appetite is no mere symptom of lust. Raven conveys an image of environmental responsibility. He sings the whale into shore such that his death transmutes into a gift, sustaining an entire human community. Raven emerges in this story as a memory, a vessel of knowledge from a time before. Raven is Sophia in the Gnostic Gospels, moving to and fro on the water, playing with creation before the eyes of a jealous God. The raven understands jealousy, embraces it, and flies onward with memories of the past that enact transformation in the present. Nonlinear flight, an unyielding, resistant presence, forbidden knowledge, and a trickiness that transmutes into environmental and social justice. These are the qualities that describe the Tlingit raven. They are also the qualities that Western natural history disavowed as it drew distinctions between different environments, such as land and sea, and the non-human animals that move between these environments. Such conceptual splitting stemmed from an ingrained discomfort with the raven's lawless authority. Raven's flight cannot be comprehended, categorized, or known, yet it remains steadfastly present, either as a different kind of world or as an alternate way of inhabiting this one. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah. This is great. So we're going to start the Q&A part of the afternoon. And as we do, I'd welcome the first question from a student or a postdoc. And Sarah, just talk for a while so we can wait while you formulate a question. Oh, let's wait for the mic because we have the audience online. And also for those of you online, if you enter a question, I will be able to convey it.
I was just going back to your point about Augustine's influence in your Christian interpretations of the raven's location that it should occupy or it shouldn't occupy. Mm-hmm. There are earlier patristic sources than Augustine, going earlier in time, but also I was wondering, is that particular interpretation of Genesis also widely held by Jewish commentators who wouldn't necessarily fall in the Euro-Christian categories?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. It's a little bit different in the Jewish tradition. In the case of Augustine, the reason he's such a central figure is because he really kind of solidifies this interpretation of the raven as what becomes kind of the bad Christian in a binary opposition to the dove. And so it's his conceptualization right around a time where Christianity is kind of shoring up its orthodox form that would carry forward. So my plan actually, I have a couple books on my shelf to do more work with the Jewish tradition that precedes Augustine's, because I think that actually it has more of a kind of embrace of some of the shape-shifting qualities that we see within the Tlingit tradition. Thank you.
There's a question.
Hello. Thank you. Wonderful talk, really thought-provoking. I'm a graduate student here in the geosciences, and I really enjoyed kind of your provocation or thinking about the archive and the natural history archive. And I was just wondering, in my own practice of using rocks as archives and sometimes rocks that are fossils of living organisms, if you see, natural history archives as like redeemable or places of redemption that can be redeemed by kind of incorporating these different histories and ways of knowing, or if that's kind of the wrong approach to have is a redemption approach and there's something else to do with the archive.
Yeah, another great question. Thank you. Redeemable, I don't know, but usable, absolutely. And I think that one of the things about practices of archive collecting and how they're passed down to us is that they preserve knowledge, right? And they may not preserve it with the intention that we want to see or attribute to that archive today. But what you can do is to take what's in the archive and to reframe the question, to pose a question that wouldn't have been present to, say, a collector like Sheldon Jackson when he was collecting the Alaskan art and belongings. He had a very specific purpose that hopefully is clear. I strongly disagree with, and I'm trying to revise. But still, I think it's important to take a look at what was collected, what's in the archive, and think about how to reformulate the question and what additional forms of knowledge or epistemologies need to be brought in conversation with it in order to answer that question as thoroughly as possible.
Bethany, we have a question.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was really like from Melville to Tlingit sources to archives to more conventional literary texts. It was really pretty dazzling. That was great. I have a question that's a big question, and I don't expect a long answer, so we can catch up on it. But I was really intrigued by your remarks at the beginning about how reading other kinds of what we might have used to have thought of as non-literary sources, maybe as oral histories or stories or anthropological sources, maybe, how including those kinds of sources into the kind of stiff world of letters, of literary departments. You were gesturing at the beginning that it helps us to undo certain practices of American originalism or teleological histories more generally. But I think it also invites us to think about maybe readers outside of traditional literary histories, right? Who are we writing these stories for? What can they do? I sense that there was a sort of like, almost like looking for a kind of redemptive potential in this kind of story. The ocean is doing a lot of work here to try to like save us from binary thinking. And I'm just sort of curious about what is the use of this kind of, let's call it post-literary history that you're writing. Who is it good for? What is it meant to do? What is its work in the world?
I'm just going to turn back to one slide, if I may. Just to get some of the archive. It's a continuation, really, of this question about the archive. This book started as a book about the raven from Jonathan Edwards, who's an 18th century theologian buried in a cemetery here, to Edgar Allan Poe. And I had a clear sense of how I could move from 1727, when Edwards talks about the raven as a type of devil, to Poe's poem. And the more I thought about that arc and that literary history, I became dissatisfied with it, because I felt that what I was doing was just reproducing another counter-narrative to a kind of national teleological story that has been told since the inception of my field, which is by training early American literature. And that's when I sort of happened upon the ravens from Alaska that are here in this institution where I work. So I didn't go looking for them. They're right here. And so I started thinking about how they relate to literary history, how they relate to my place within this institution and within the profession and in my field, really. And this particular archive is an archive, as you referenced in your question, that is a colonial archive in its origins, no longer as it's represented here, but these stories were collected by missionaries first, then anthropologists who were like a little bit better in terms of their agenda, and then now there is an edition of Tlingit Raven stories that is essentially a kind of transcription of the oral recordings that were taken by anthropologists that have been produced as bilingual by Tlingit scholars. And so it honors the specificity of the storytellers. It honors the specificity of the language, which I've been struggling to learn myself, and will never be completely proficient at. But I find it important to inhabit those spaces of discomfort in order to continue to kind of push against the grain of the paradigms that I was trained in that are limited in terms of their epistemology, limited in terms of how they can understand American literary history, to move beyond a simple counter-narrative, such as the Edwards to Poe, which would be a fun and interesting book to write, but kind of wouldn't do the intellectual work that I want to do in rethinking the historiography of the field as it kind of moves into future iterations.
I'll check the Q&A. I will in a second. So I actually had a question myself, but then I saw a hand there. So I'm seeing Lars there, so this is maybe partly for your benefit. Is there within European narratives, I didn't know much of what sort of Southern Europe until today thought about the raven, but not very good. But I believe sort of like Nordic culture, the raven is much more exalted as sort of a source of wisdom. There was the sort of the trade for writing, right? Is there some, qualitatively the environment in Sweden and Norway is much more similar to the Pacific Northwest. Mm-hmm. And there's also the distance is much shorter. Right, there has been connection over the centuries. Is that relevant, or is it just a separate spur of human knowledge? What is happening in the Nordic countries, right? Because the Nordic cultures were also part of Great Britain, and we're sitting here in New Jersey. South Jersey used to be New Sweden. So is there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the raven's a bird of the north. That's where it thrives in kind of northern cultures. I was just reading a raven ornithologist who has compared the size of the ravens in northern Maine to the size in Alaska. And so I think northern cultures, not just northern cultures that are of the Indigenous Pacific West, but many northern cultures have raven stories that emulate in some way observations of the raven in the natural world and how it behaves. And I do want to complicate, I don't want to replicate a kind of binary of saying that the raven is a fully fleshed out, interesting literary representation within the Pacific Northwest and simplified within Anglo stories. I want to also suggest that there are sort of lost literary modes within European traditions as well. So like just thinking the opening line of Poe's poem, sorry, it's a very literary example, but the speaker references reading a book of forgotten lore. And the whole kind of gist of Poe's poems, 1845, is thinking about the raven as a kind of vessel for older forms of knowledge. So I do want to suggest that those older forms of knowledge exist within a kind of European Western tradition as well, but they get repressed in certain ways.
So there was a question.
Thank you. A super interesting talk. I mean, it's intriguing from an evolutionary perspective that the sort of radiation of the apes and humans goes very much in parallel with the radiation of the crows and then the ravens, all sort of starting out in Southeast Asia and essentially following the figs into Africa when the humans come out of the rest of the apes. So why don't we see more connections, given that the raven is the largest, most intelligent in terms of the complex problems it can solve. It's analogous to humans within the corvidae. It probably followed humans around to get into Alaska. And they're really easy to make as pets. You can domesticate them and they'll be faithful to you for decades. They're really easy to live with. So it's intriguing that there's more sort of relationships or references to them in the sort of historical literature and in the early legends.
So you're wondering, given the raven's kind of evolutionary parallels with humans and that it's kind of on, I don't want to say on par, but can you just reiterate the question a little bit?
They've probably been associated with humans longer than most of the things we've domesticated.
Yeah.
Dogs probably similar to dogs and ravens have been following us for half a million years.
Yes, and it's wolves too, because it's wolves, ravens, and people migrated together and worked in a kind of symbiotic relationship. The ravens would sort of point out to the people or wolves where the prey was, so they could, the humans could kill it, and then the ravens could feast after. So, I mean, it's a question about kind of raven intelligence and symbiosis, and I don't know, like I don't know exactly how to answer that question from the limitations of my own disciplinary perspective, I guess. But what I do think a lot about is the relation between natural observation and stories. And I do think that there is something about the raven's intelligence that is both a source of intrigue and also a kind of threat. So, I talked a lot about theology, but when the raven appears as a supernatural presence, it's much more interesting than the dove, which is just like a good, banal bird. So there's something about the supernatural that is intriguing, that it's not just a negative, it's not just a dismissal. And I think that it is both the proximity to humans that you're suggesting and a kind of recognition of intelligence that's kind of, commensurate in some way more so than other non-human animals.
So I have two questions here online. The first one is from Michael Burns, and was wondering whether you had the opportunity to talk with Tlingit totem pole artist Nathan Johnson when he visited in Princeton early in the fall? And if so, how the conversation went?
I did have that opportunity. I took my class to see a carving demonstration that Nathan Jackson did. I don't know if there's at the Arts Council in town, Adam Welch, the director, commissioned Nathan Jackson, who's one of the foremost living Tlingit carvers, to do a totem pole of the raven and salmon story. The raven and fog woman story. Fog woman gives salmon to the people. And I actually gave a talk right after that occasion. I loved meeting Nathan Jackson, actually, and he sat and listened to the talk. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. He didn't give me a sort of detailed response to some of the things that I'm working on, but I learned a lot from the experience of watching him carve, and think it's really important to kind of, in my own work, to think about Tlingit artists today and how they're speaking to some of the objects from the past that I'm working on in my project.
And then there's another question from Tyron. So they were intrigued by your presentation, Western Natural History's Incapacity to Conceptualize the Intertidal, including Carl Linnaeus. But they were also curious about the epistemological status of the seashore, thinking about mollusks and amphibians, which was under intense scrutiny, apparently, at least since the 17th century. Do you see differences in epistemologies between the intertidal and the seashore?
Please send me some citations, because I would love, I'm in an English department, and I would love citations from different disciplinary perspectives. Thought a lot about the seashore in literature. It has, of course, a long history of conceptualization within literature, and there I was thinking about it as more of a kind of static space of kind of movement, but fundamentally distinct space of sea and land. But a lot of the work that I'm doing to track the rise of a notion of intertidal ecology I'm getting from secondary resources, so I would love some more citations for 17th century texts. I'll look at it.
Yeah, and there's a question up front here. I can get here.
This will be perhaps an utterly predictable question for you, but it does lead to what we might call British indigeneity. What about the ravens in the Tower of London? You must know all about that.
I do know
because it's so well known.
Yeah, I do know about the ravens in the Tower of London. You just want me to talk about them?
Well, for instance, there's one line that connects them with perhaps a totally spurious connection with earlier culture is Welshness, and some of the Welsh kings assuming the identity of ravens in their names.
So I have dabbled in Welsh medieval literature, which contains a lot of ravens. Ravens are a kind of iconic figure within medieval literature. Kind of going back to Gabe's question about the North, as a sign of victors in battle. When the battle has been won, then the ravens come and they swoop down. So I don't know, because I don't know the exact date that the ravens got in the Tower of London. I've kind of always assumed 19th century, but I don't know. But there does seem to be a trajectory there between the figure of the raven as a sign for kind of defeat, and then the notion of the ravens in the Tower of London as, a sign of empire. But I would need to do sort of more work to piece together that trajectory. Maybe you can help me.
I can give you so there is, it is said, I don't know, it is said that it begins with the reign of Charles II.
Okay.
Who was very, very interested in accumulating mythology
Ah,
after what happened to his father.
that's great.
but it is also thought that that might itself be a Victorian fantasy.
That's great.
So unfortunately, I got the sign where they need the room after this. And so I'd like you to join me in thanking Sarah again for. And this is the final seminar for this semester, but we will have 2 more seminars here in Guillotin in the spring semester before we move to the new building in March of next year. So, all right, thank you.